Hey y'all, welcome back. It is me, Britt Reacts, and we're going to jump right back into part 2 of Roman slavery versus American slavery, how they were different. So many of you enjoyed this history lesson with me. I was kind of shocked. The most popular part of it being the doo-doo shared doo-doo rag, which I can't get over. But all right, I kind of went back just a little bit so that we could start and pick up back where we left off. I said that really weird. Judge your mom, not me. Okay, here we go.
He said planters often work them to death. To a cold-blooded businessman, it made sense to grind down a temporary worker and replace him with another cheap body. Indentured servants were supposed to have basic rights, but records show these were mostly fiction. Colonial courts almost always sided with the planters if there were complaints of
I think my headphones are on backwards. Y'all keep watching. I'm just going to switch them, okay?
abuse. Contracts could be extended on trumped-up charges. Breaking a tool, talking back, or falling ill. Idleness or insubordination often ended in chains, mutilation, or branding.
You got in
Some
trouble for
had their
falling
ears
ill?
clipped or bore scars from savage
Ears
whippings.
clipped?
So, was this slavery? By any modern standard, yes, it was a form of slavery. It wasn't perpetual or radicalized like African slavery would become, but for many, even back then, it was slavery in all but name. White servants were still toiling away as Africans began to arrive in greater numbers. They were listed as indentured servants, and like the whites, could finish their contract. Some, like Anthony Johnson, earned freedom, even himself owning servants later. But he was a very rare case. The laws were about to change. In 1662, hereditary slavery was codified. In 1664, Maryland law stated all Africans and their descendants were slaves for life. In 1669, Virginia law, an act about the casual killing of slaves, declared that if a slave died during punishment, it wouldn't be treated as a felony. It effectively legalized the killing of enslaved black people,
Jesus.
something never codified for white servants. There was also John Punch, sentenced to life servitude in 1640 for running away, a punishment white servants didn't face. In fact, he was the first person sentenced to perpetual slavery. Meanwhile, the Dutchman and Scotsman that he'd run away with had 4 years added to their servitude. The blacks and whites
Wait a minute. Again, this is one of the things I'm going to preference and say. I possibly learned this in school, y'all. But when I tell you, I was at school for 2 reasons. To go to lunch and hang out, and for the bell to ring and leave. Okay? I got there on time every day. I did what I was supposed to do. I was going through the motions. Oh, and for dance class. I was in my high school. I was like considered a dance major. And so I had like multiple dance classes a day. And that was like the only thing that got me up out of bed in the morning. All right. I was not there to learn history. So for those of you that want to judge me, it's not about where I went to school or whatever. It's just like I was there to do the bare minimum. I was a too cool for school kind of girl. All right. And I'm not ashamed to say it. But I just didn't realize like there were almost levels to slavery and that the laws changed. I just never had that information inside my brain. Okay. I didn't have it. How awful is that 3 different slaves ran away and only one got a specific perpetual lifetime sentence to slavery. Wow. And so it seems as if these people just decided that once where all slaves were kind of equal, then it became the African, or then would turn into African American, black, whatever you want to call them, slaves were lesser than and were not equal to their white skinned counterparts. Because you can't even say like white people. They were from other places as well. They were also brought here to work. So I never knew that. That's really wildly interesting. Okay. I did have a moment where I looked at that man's nipples and I'm like, wow, those are kind of large. I'm here to react, all right? And that includes my intrusive thoughts. Thank you.
Scotsman that he'd run away with had 4 years added to their servitude. The blacks and whites might have worked together, but now the landowners were writing wicked laws that would change everything. Solidarity sometimes bloomed between black slaves and white servants. Records tell of them running away together, sharing food, hiding in the forests, and even plotting rebellion. When they did run away, there would be ads in newspapers, such as the plantation runaways who appeared in an ad in the Maryland Gazette on August 20th, 1761. The owner was offering a 40-shilling reward for the capture of these 4 black runaways. On April 23,
With broad teeth.
1775, in the Virginia Gazette, the same man was offering $40 for the capture of the two white runaways, a young Scot and an Englishman. Both ads were written and signed by the same man, George Washington. In 1663, in Gloucester County, 9 servants angry about not
Back then, the president used to sign news ads? Wow.
Washington. In 1663, in Gloucester County, 9 servants angry about not getting enough food planned to arm themselves and march on the governor's house and demand their freedom. Someone snitched, and before the date even arrived, they were arrested. 4 were hanged. The snitch was given his freedom and 5,000 pounds of tobacco, although he had to compensate the master for the time off. The most famous uprising, Bacon's Rebellion, saw poor whites, black slaves, and free blacks rise up against the ruling class. They nearly toppled the elite, terrifying planters not only for the violence, but because it revealed a dangerous truth. The underclass, if united, could challenge the entire system. The reaction from wealthy Virginians was ruthless. Lawmakers began hard-coding racial distinctions, granting poor whites small privileges, easing punishments for them, and spreading the idea that freedom was a racial entitlement, not a universal right. This divide-and-rule strategy split potential allies apart, creating a racial hierarchy that distracted poor whites from their own exploitation while propagating racism against blacks. In 1705's
It distracted poor whites from their own plight, if you will. Distracted. Y'all hear that word? Distracted. There's so much that happens that keeps us distracted from what's really going on, from what's really affecting us. Let that be a message. Don't let that go over your head. Don't let it go over your head. That is then, that is now, and that is in the future. Don't be distracted.
own exploitation while propagating racism against blacks. In 1705's Virginia slave codes, legal loopholes were closed to prevent any black slave ever becoming free. They became property, barely viewed as human, while poor white servants viewed their own privilege as rooted in skin color. Many years later, W.E.B. Du Bois argued that the same divide-and-rule tactics were still at work in the post-slavery South. In Black Reconstruction in America, he described how the Southern elite built a psychological wage for poor whites, an illusion of status over black workers, stoking fear.
A psychological wage, meaning the poor white people thought they were better than black people just because of the color of their skin. When obviously no one was better than, but like, hello, you're poor too. I saw something. It was a comedian was joking and saying it's so funny because he was he had a deep Southern accent, and he was saying like it's really funny because I grew up in the South, and white privilege is a real thing, but the people who are usually white supremacy, he said, not white privilege. White supremacy is a real thing, but it's interesting because the people who are usually screaming white supremacy do not look superior at all. Like that was like his bit, and I think I laughed. I laughed. I thought it was funny. But it's like, it's such a psychological thing that these people convince themselves that they were better than people of color. And they believed it so deeply and so far, and used the Bible against their slaves to show that, like, see, look, you're supposed to honor your master. Mind you, meanwhile, nowhere in the Bible does it says a master is white and a slave is black. But hey, we've had this conversation. I think I had this conversation, and how I got here was because in the Bible it does talk about slavery, and it doesn't condone it, but it talks about it in a way that makes you wonder, like, why didn't the Bible condemn slavery? And my Bible, I have a study Bible. I actually meant to leave it on my desk. I had a church group thing right before this, and I'm gonna put it over there. It's a study Bible, and it has like sections where you can, like, it asks questions and it will give you the answer. And it said slavery in biblical times was so embedded into the culture, and it was just almost like another job, career path, and so it wasn't brutal and looked at, and it could be brutal, but there were laws against the brutality and expectations of how you were supposed to treat your slaves, and masters were held accountable for that. And so that is the difference. So anyway, I say all that to say it's so interesting because this hierarchy was simply a mental construct put in place that people subscribed to, and it blew way out of proportion. It ended up into this very radicalized way that made slavery inhumane, brutal, and just plain awful.
Wage for poor whites, an illusion of status over black workers, stoking fear and hatred to stop unity. It drove racism and protected the slave-owning class from serious criticism. We'll come back to African slavery soon, but first let's look at more details about the Roman slave. Roman slaves had no protection from cruelty. If someone injured or killed another man's slave, the victim legally was not the enslaved person, but his owner, who could claim damages. Even in assault cases, it was not the violated slave who had the standing, but the master whose property had been dishonored. Still, over the centuries, a glimmer of legal protection began to creep in. The most significant shift came under Emperor Constantine in 319 CE, when an imperial rescript declared a master who intentionally killed a slave, whether by beating, burning, or torture, could be charged with murder. It sounds obvious now, but this was a radical idea in Roman law. Killing a slave could be considered murder of a human being, not just destruction of property. For most of Roman history, such protections were non-existent. Under Nero,
he doesn't look well. He needs physical labor in the fresh air. Put him outside.
When a slave attacked his owner, 400 were put to death. Slaves were regularly tortured, executed by beasts in the arena, crucified, or burned. These were the worst cases.
Y'all, how does that make sense? How does that make sense? If a slave unalived his owner, 400 slaves were put to death? What? I guess it was just a way to scare the slaves and say, like, don't let your brother get you killed. Don't let your homie get you unalived. Wow.
Slave attacked his owner. 400 were put to death. Slaves were regularly tortured, executed by beasts in the arena, crucified, or burned. These were the worst cases, but slave experiences varied. A slave could be born in servitude, raised in a household, or taken as spoils of war and sold at auction. Sellers sometimes concealed illnesses, so cautious buyers brought physicians to inspect the merchandise. If not bought for their bodies, they were bought for their brains. A clever or educated slave might earn his owner a fortune, sometimes even managing businesses and making significant financial decisions. The law allowed them to keep a personal fund, a peculium, which they could use to buy freedom if the master agreed to sell. Roman households had specialized slaves for nearly every function: bakers, cooks, confectioners, porters, bedroom attendants, little bearers, and literary slaves who acted as readers, scribes, and copyists. Some highly skilled slaves were more valuable and more likely to be manumitted or made free.
I know that's right. Listen, you got to find a silver lining where you can. Count your blessings. Thank you, Jesus, for making me scrawny and smart. Thank you for making me short and frail. Like, listen, whatever was keeping you alive, just find something to be grateful for, I guess.
Some highly skilled slaves were more valuable and more likely to be manumitted or made free. Working hours depended entirely on the master. Some slaves had tolerable conditions in households where owners weren't tyrannical or lustful. Public holidays might bring occasional rest days, but the essence of slavery was dehumanizing, and punishments for mistakes could be horrific. Some wealthy women were notoriously brutal to female slaves, beating them savagely for minor errors. Evidence from slaves themselves is rare, but Roman historians mention maltreatment. Rebellions, self-harm, and frequent runaway attempts hint at the misery many endured. Some deliberately broke tools or made mistakes just to assert some autonomy, often ending in beatings. Punishments ranged from whippings with rods or whips to branding runaways on the forehead. Some were chained for farm labor or humiliated with the furca, a heavy wooden yoke carried through the streets. Slaves didn't wear a uniform and blended in with the poorest free citizens. The Senate once proposed marking them with a distinctive clothing, but abandoned the idea for fear that slaves would realize their numbers and rebel. Life in the countryside or the mines was brutal and often short. The historian Diodorus Siculus wrote that quarry slaves would rather be dead than alive, with life expectancy sometimes only months, so it was often a punishment. For educated city slaves with decent masters, manumission was realistic. Estimates suggest 20% were freed, possibly more in the cities. Freedom could be earned, saved for, or granted as an owner's gesture of virtue. Some freed men became heirs, will executors, even wealthy citizens. Slavery was always dehumanizing, but life ranged from unbearable to comparatively privileged. The gap between a slave accountant in a patrician household and a chained quarry worker was vast. Freedom cost whatever the slave was worth, A skilled doctor or intellectual might cost 4,000 to 8,000 sesterces, with some fetching more than 10,000 if renowned for beauty or talents. The physician Galen trained.
What I tell y'all about pretty privilege? Pretty privilege has been a thing since the dawn of time. What? You mean to tell?
More than 10,000 if renowned for beauty or talents.
I cost more because I'm beautiful and I can sing. What in the inhumane is going on here? Wow.
The physician Galen trained enslaved doctors. Cicero's secretary was a slave, as was the storyteller Aesop. Rarely, sex slaves could buy freedom, like Vibia Calibi, who later managed a brothel as a freedwoman. A tough, strong...
Not being freed and becoming a madam. I mean, I guess it was the only thing she knew, but like, girl. Oh, it's frustrating.
Vibia Calibi, who later managed a brothel as a freedwoman. A tough, strong male who looked or proved he could fight could win his owner's respect in the gladiatorial arena. The best specimens could cost between 3,000 to 8,000 sesterces. The very best as much as 12 to 15,000. If a gladiator won many fights and pleased his owner, he could win freedom, symbolized by a wooden sword, the rudis. They rarely bought freedom themselves, lacking the money. Flama, a Syrian gladiator, famously won his freedom 4 times but kept fighting. He fought 34 times, winning 21 before dying aged 30 after a trident pierced his neck. Old for a gladiator, most of them died in their 20s. If slaves did buy their freedom, Rome imposed few limits on what they could achieve. Freedmen held low status but could amass wealth and property. Some gained powerful positions, and while they couldn't hold political office, their children could. Romans obsessed over birthrights, but upward mobility was possible. In the U.S., plantation slaves were closer to Roman field or quarry slaves, sometimes household slaves, but certainly not doctors or scribes.
Right.
They could sometimes purchase freedom if the owners allowed it. In 1839 Cincinnati, 42% of free blacks had self-purchased. Many tried to free relatives, like Venture Smith, captured in Africa, sold for 4 gallons of rum and calico, enslaved across Barbados, Rhode Island, and Connecticut. In 1765, he bought freedom for 71 pounds and 2 shillings, and later purchased his wife, son, and 2 daughters. He paid $200 each for his sons, 40 pounds for his wife, and he even purchased a slave himself, who ran away. Freedom could also be granted in wills. In parts of the South near the Revolutionary era, this helped increase the free black populations from less than 1% to about 10% by 1810. Field labor was brutal, often 15 to 16 hours daily. Slaves worked cotton, rice, tobacco, sugar, or...
Let me tell y'all something. Let me tell y'all something right now. You give me one physical task, one workout class, and I need a 48-hour period to get back and ready to do the next workout class. 14 to 16 hours outside every day? Really, the only thing getting these people through had to have been Jesus. There's no other source of motivation. There's no way.
15 to 16 hours daily. Slaves worked cotton, rice, tobacco, sugar, or trades like carpentry, tailoring, driving, and domestic service. By the 1850s, nearly 500,000 worked in cities and factories, quarries, shipyards, or building infrastructure. Violence was constant, prosecutions rare. In some states, there were laws against cruelty, and as time went on, it was supposed to be illegal to kill your slave. But in truth, owners could use loopholes to get away with cruelty. In Louisiana, the 1806 Black Code stated, "The slave is entirely subject to the will of his master, who may correct him and chastise him, though not with unusual rigor, nor so as to maim or mutilate him, or to cause his death." For cruelty, the law imposed fines of $200 to $500, but flogging or striking with a whip, leather thong, switch, or small stick was explicitly permitted. In practice, you could easily get away with murder. Slaves couldn't testify in court, meaning a white witness was required if a slave was killed. Worse, an owner could escape punishment simply by his own oath, swearing innocence, and then walking free. One case involved North Carolina Judge Thomas Ruffin, who refused to charge an owner for assault and battery.
Thomas Ruffin, as in David Ruffin of the Temptations? Okay.
Carolina.
This is the way that my brain is able to retain things. Is I must correlate facts with music facts or something left brain. In order to connect what's going on the right, I have to tether it to something from the left. David Ruffin of the Temptations.
Judge Thomas Ruffin, who refused to charge an owner for assault and battery, declaring the beating necessary to render the submission of the slave perfect. Very few cases ever went to court, and even if they did, it was almost impossible for the slave to win. While a few owners were prosecuted, sentences were lenient. The Rapides Parish District Court convicted Joseph Populus of stabbing a slave.
No one else thinks their hands look like black beans, jelly beans, a bean. The illustration is really phenomenal here. You know, the way they're moving, like the like Sims, the fighting characters. Come on, y'all. It's been a wild beginning to September. Like, we got to find some joy. Let me find joy in these history videos because this is hilarious. I'm wiping away tears. Come on, give me a break.
The Rapides Parish District Court convicted Joseph Populus of stabbing a slave to death, but the jury recommended mercy. The judge handed down only 12 months of hard labor. In St. Martin Parish, a jury found George White and Clarence Ward guilty of inflicting inhuman and cruel treatment on a slave who died from his injuries. Each was fined $400 and even had the audacity to appeal, though the conviction was upheld. When W.H. Davis was accused of deliberately shooting a slave, his defense argued that killing a slave, considered property, was not illegal. Local courts agreed, but the state Supreme Court overturned it, stating slaves are treated in our law as property and also as persons. But owners
but like who was upholding that? Not the sheriffs and the deputies in these little small towns. Who was upholding this Supreme Court law?
Continually got away with brutal violence and murder. When a man shot and blinded a slave named John Hall, his owner, S.D. McCutcheon, sued the shooter, claiming his property was now useless. The injured slave had merely been, quote, lurking about a chicken house. Yet the court awarded McCutcheon $1,500 in damages for lost property value. The shooter faced no personal penalty. The fact was, owners routinely escaped punishment for sadism and downright murder. Slaves were chained, collared, whipped, branded, and mutilated. And this was common. Ads for runaways noted disfigurements like little toe of each foot is off, or toes of both feet burnt off. One document described a man murdered in a spiked casket, his body turned into perfect mincemeat. Others died under lashes, their lives ending in sanctioned brutality. Frederick Douglass wrote of his Aunt Hester, whipped until blood pooled on the ground. The louder she screamed, the harder he whipped. Records show how many were whipped for days, left unconscious, bled to death, or died from untreated wounds. Due to this extreme violence, and something we'll talk about soon, rebellions were rare. Nat Turner's 1831 rebellion in Virginia killed 55 to 65 whites. Mobs retaliated, murdering as many as 120 slaves and free blacks. Authorities executed 56, some not even involved. It was horrendous.
Freed blacks and some not even involved. If you were black, that's all that mattered. It didn't matter freed, involved or not. Wow.
A brutal message sent to anyone who might consider revolt. This wasn't Rome. Politicians were also always fighting about...
Yeah, because imagine if like you had the mitigated gall to go up against your master, but you knew that you would cause dozens to hundreds of your slave counterparts to also lose their lives. That would keep a lot of people quiet. A lot of people from rebelling.
Consider revolt. This wasn't Rome. Politicians were also always fighting about slavery. On May 22, 1856, abolitionist Senator Charles Sumner was nearly beaten to death on the Senate floor for an insult and an anti-slavery speech. The attacker, Democratic Senator Preston Brooks of South Carolina, was hailed as a hero in the South and re-elected.
A
type of black gladiator existed, but as boxers, and not usually fighting for freedom. Still, Virginia slave Tom Molyneux made his owner a fortune boxing and later emancipated himself with $500. Owners often entered strong males in fights but avoided risking valuable property. Slaves were trained to fight for entertainment, and there is evidence that the owners encouraged slaves to scrap with each other in less formal surroundings. They pit slaves against slaves not just for entertainment, but to prevent solidarity. Frederick Douglass recounted fighting the man hired to break him, writing, "I resolved to fight. The man he fought was called a slave breaker, like when you break in a wild horse." These professional breakers were usually white men, but also sometimes black slaves who had been favored by the owner. Douglass said owners engineered ill will between the slaves, sowing division, ranking some higher than others. The divide and rule strategy again. He said on holidays owners gave slaves alcohol and watched them fight, but Douglass never partook. He understood the important psychological aspects of slavery. Give the men days off, ply them with booze, and make some think that they are more special than others, and there won't be much solidarity. Women faced different horrors. They were regularly assaulted by owners and had no recourse to lodge a complaint. A book described one case where a woman fought back. The traitor died of infection, and she was charged with murder. One enslaved man on a Louisiana plantation recalled white wives tolerating their husbands' abuse of slaves. Young women were forced to procreate to save owners money. Many were—
Just to be clear, as far as abuse, we're talking about SA. Okay? These women were okay with their husbands graping their slaves and having children in response to said grape.
husbands' abuse of slaves. Young women were forced to procreate to save owners money. Many were seen as breeders paired with strong males to produce children that would be sold later. From an early age, enslaved children carried water, weeded the fields, fed livestock, and drove cows to pasture. By 7 to 12, they were sent to grueling field labor. Older or injured slaves often spun cotton, cooked, or made clothes. When they died, they were often dumped in an unmarked grave outside of the plantation. Some owners allowed slaves to work on the side, grow gardens, or even earn small bonuses, but these kind masters were rare. Like in Rome, U.S. slavery in the South was a marker of wealth. Only 25 to 30% of white Southern households owned slaves, and just 1%, the elite—
I didn't know that. I did not know that. That's not a lot.
5 to 30% of white Southern households owned slaves, and just 1%, the elite, owned more than 50. Poor whites, often referred to as waste people and clay eaters in educated circles, had no chance of owning a slave. Most slaves were illiterate. Only 1 to 5% could read, compared to 25 to 30% of poor whites. Laws made teaching black slaves illegal. Frederick Douglass taught himself while in hiding with old newspapers snuck to him by poor whites he'd befriended. Douglass later became a towering writer and orator, proving that slaveholders' fears of educated slaves were justified. Even after abolition, the powerful set poor whites and freed blacks against each other. Douglass wrote, "By encouraging the enmity of the poor laboring white man against the blacks, slaveholders succeeded in making the said white man almost as much a slave as the black slave himself." W.E.B. Du Bois also described this as a divide-and-conquer tactic, later echoed in FBI efforts to sabotage the racial unity called for by the likes of murdered Fred Hampton and Martin Luther King Jr. As Douglass put it to President Andrew Johnson, "They divided both to conquer each." And many years later, the Washington Post reminded Americans of this with an article whose headline went, "How American Oligarchs Created the Concept of Race to Divide and Conquer the Poor." In Rome, slavery wasn't racial at all. Divide and rule.
Message.
Yes, but not over race. By 1860, approximately 4 million enslaved African Americans made up 13% of the U.S. population and 1/3 of the South. Their forced labor powered a booming cotton industry, which at its peak accounted for 50% of all U.S. export earnings.
Wow.
It directly made up an estimated 5 to 10% of the national GDP, and far more indirectly. Their blood and toil were the backbone of elite wealth, state power, and global trade. And slavery isn't gone. Today, an estimated 38 to 50 million people remain in forced labor worldwide. Chattel slavery is illegal, but across Africa, Asia, and the Middle East, practices still exist that look disturbingly like slavery of the past. Not to mention the millions illegally trafficked almost the world over, including to the USA and other highly developed nations. Before they ever reached the plantations, countless captives endured a harrowing voyage. Watch Life on a Slave Ship to see the brutal reality of that journey, or click on this video instead.
Whoa. Well, guys, there you have it. There you have it. I'm sorry, I just read this. The title of this video says mixed kids are just white kids that don't sunburn. Like, what? Anywho, let me know your thoughts on that. Let me know what we should react to next on this channel, and go and have the day you deserve. Peace.